Yes, after some technical issues, we are now very pleased to welcome Tamar Blickstein joining us from Venice. Your issues seem to be resolved because your image is as clear as the Venetian lagoon during the COVID lockdown, which is very, very clear. Tamar Blickstein is a long-standing associated fellow of the Effective Society Center here in Berlin and a collaborator in some of the most tedious and work-intensive publication projects of that center also. Tamar Blickstein holds a PhD in cultural anthropology from Columbia University and master's degree from the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales and from Sciences Po in Paris. She's currently a Marie Sklodowska-Curie individual postdoc fellow at Ca' Foscari University in Venice and also at the Humboldt University Berlin. And I guess she's commuting as good as it gets, if it's possible, between Venice and Berlin. Not the worst places to hang out. She also co-leads, together with Karina Rocktaschel, the Ecology and Affect Working Group at Effective Societies. Tamar has published and conducted ethnographic research on colonial modes of dispossession, racialization, and contested memory politics in Latin America and Europe, and authors a notable CRC publication, Affects of Racialization, a chapter in the Effective Society's Key Concepts, volume 2019. And her Marie Curie project examines the effects of environmental loss in the agribusiness and deforestation frontiers of the South American Gran Chaco region. Tamar's title is Settler, Colonial Affect, and World-Making Narratives in the Argentine Chaco. Tamar, welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, Tyrone. I'm so grateful that Jan invited me to this discussion. I wanted to just begin by saying that I discovered Tyrone Palmer's paper just because Jan invited me to join a discussion about it a few months ago, and it was so exciting to me because it kind of I mean, in addition to what I was sort of in two modes, because on the one hand I was following his intervention, and on the other hand it was like everything that he was saying reminded me of how the settler colonists that I studied in the Gran Chaco area of South America, in a sort of a settler frontier zone of Argentina, it's really captured how they imagined their world and the obliteration that this was predicated on. And so what this has allowed me to do is I've wanted today to return to a piece of something that I haven't really thought about directly since the dissertation, which is looking at Mircea Eliade's work on the eternal return, which, I mean, he's very much come out of fashion for good reason, because he's, I think, quite a problematic thinker. But at the time, I thought, wow, his ideas, he's thinking like a settler in a way. He's thinking about world making like a settler, and it was so helpful heuristically for me to kind of articulate and weave together some of the narratives that I'd found about amongst settler colonists in this region. So I'm going to present that section, and then at the end maybe elaborate a bit more without reading, just some of the consequences of these world-making narratives that I've seen, and also maybe raise some questions that Tyrone Palmer's work has prompted me to think about, that I don't necessarily have answers to. So Well, maybe I'll just begin with the spoiler, because sometimes we don't get to the end of of the paper. And I just want to say that one of the questions that that really came up for me when I discovered Palmer's paper now the article a few months ago, was the question of whether it's possible to think of this kind of worlding project as something that that actually is even though it has a certain givenness that Tyrone Palmer discusses, it's also a givenness that in a way needs to be produced, at least in a settler colonial context, if the goal of the settler society is to replace the native on the land, let's say, and if that has not completely been successful because a native is still there and natives are still here, very much so, then what do these settler societies have to do? What sort of affective, ontological, in addition to, of course, legislative, etc., what kind of work do they need to do in order to keep this worlding thing reinvented constantly, in order to keep it intact? And so this is a question that I was thinking about. What does this look like, this kind of reworlding project? So I'll jump right into a scene that I'm calling "Here There Was Nothing," right? So you see all this? Asked Marco, slicing his hand horizontally through the thick Chaco heat across a vast landscape of farmland and pasture. Acá no había nada. Here there was nothing. He was squinting into the distance, his lips gently pursed and his voice trailing as if from far away. A moment later, he let his arm drop, and with a sidelong glance to me and my notebook, he added, "There were aborigines." That was during my first visit to the Argentine Chaco in 2010, but I would hear this refrain, "Here there was nothing," throughout my fieldwork in Argentina's former cotton belt. Like other colonos, who are descendants of white European cotton planters, also sometimes called gringos, Marco spoke like a frontiersman whose pride in his farmland is premised on an act of creation. From the primordial void, a new world was born. Yet Marco's afterthought, "There were aborigines," gave me pause. What did it mean for Marco to identify as, what did it mean for Marco to identify as a pioneer in empty soil, while also recognizing that the aborigines, many of whom had worked on his land, were here before him? So at first glance, Marco's words are not that surprising. Argentina was officially forged as a white European nation of immigrants, a settler colonial society that, according to its myth of founding, had eliminated its indigenous populations in genocidal campaigns such as the Conquista del Desierto, the conquest of the desert. And as many of us know, the myth of the vanished Indian is really commonplace in settler colonial societies. It's perhaps one of the defining features of a settler colonial society, which is marked by an attempt to symbolically, materially, somatically, politically eliminate the native from the land. And actually, we can get into this later if you want, but this is a feature that some have argued distinguishes settler colonial societies from other colonial forms. So whereas, let's say, the British in India are after the exploitation of the added value of native labor, according to this sort of very schematic model. The settler society, in a settler society, this colonizer-colonized relation would be defined by wanting to extract value from the land, and the native in this logic figures as an obstacle that has to be eliminated. But we have a problem in my field site where Marco's omission of indigenous people seems very hard to reconcile with his planter community's actual practices, and might I add, the phenomenological everyday world, right? With a lowercase w. And as my native COM interlocutors would often point out, colonos like Marco built their cotton plantation regimes on native land and labor throughout the 20th century. So that is to say, until the manual labor regime was gradually displaced by large-scale agribusiness over the last decade, soy fields, cattle fields. So this was the question that was, how is this possible? This is a question I would discuss with my indigenous interlocutors too. Like, what is the trick? What is going on in their minds that allows them to do this thing that so affects our lives? So this question was something that I would discuss with my indigenous interlocutors. What if the colonos know that they relied on this mass backbreaking indigenous and criollo as well labor in the cotton fields, how then do they sustain a worldview in which they alone made Chaco, built Chaco? What logics, beliefs, affects, and ontologies of land and labor help to shape this contrasting attitude to the land and labor of others? So now getting into Mircea Eliade. So in his classic work on the eternal return, Mircea Eliade suggests that origin myths in what he calls traditional societies tend to return cyclically to primordial archetypes, so as to repeat the act of the gods. So very much a kind of worlding theory, right? For which Eliade has, it's almost caricatural, and this is why Eliade's work has been very much criticized. It's been called ahistorical, essentializing, and reproducing caricatures of the primitive, archetypes of the primitive and the modern, among their numerous critiques. But I found that read against the grain of this distinction, this primitive modern distinction that he's enmeshed in, Eliade's ontology of settlement is actually a kind of philosophical articulation of what many of my settler informants were talking about. So Eliade proposed that people founding a new world in what he calls uncharted soil imagine their new beginnings within a cycle of what he calls sacred time. Founding is not conceived as a profane human act of linear rupture with the past, nor as an quote-unquote extirpation of previous world. That's a quote. Extirpation is a quote from Francis Bacon. Well, I can find the quote later if you're interested. But instead, it's the sacred repetition of divine creation itself. Origin stories of founding thus describe the original birth of a world. The emptiness and chaos of the desert are radically transformed into what he calls cosmos, forms, and norms. Moreover, territorial conquest of an uncharted land are only made real through what he calls rituals of taking possession, a notion that was later historicized in a more rigorous way in works like Patricia Seed's comparative study on ceremonies of possession. Now, most of my Colono interlocutors narrated the saga of their ancestors' immigration to the Argentine Chaco as a primordial creative act, a 0 point before which there was nothing. This was reinforced by standard history texts, school books, children's school books, university texts that I found in the region. The refrain that acá no había nada, that here there was nothing, was so deeply ingrained and so often repeated that it seemed to have taken on a variety of metonymic meanings and associations over the years, much like the Argentine trope of the desert itself, what I mentioned as this conquest of the desert campaign, where the desert there represents, you would think it represents the absence of indigenous people, but actually the indigenous people are constitutive of lack, right? Are constitutive of lack of civilization and modernity in this concept of the desert. And often, in fact, the descriptor of the desert and the discourses of these informants would follow those kinds of statements. So, for example, Estanislava, a retired farmer in her late 70s, who had, along with her husband, employed Aborígenes in her cotton fields until a decade or two ago, offers a typical narrative. She explained that the immigrants suffered enormous obstacles in building a colony in the Chaco because all of this was a desert back then. So what she says, just to quote her, when the immigrants came, there was nothing here. It was completely uninhabited. They had to begin everything from scratch in the bushland by hand. This was a desert, right? And when I ask her what she means by a desert, she's very clear about the lack that this refers to. When we say desert, she's explaining to me, what we mean is there was no population. It was uninhabited. There were no other people here. It was just a savage bushland until the other immigrants came. They sent help, they sent tools, and then finally we started to build and plant, and a population began. And then it became a community, it became a colony. And this is somebody who, again, in other narratives, we would discuss the indigenous people that she had employed, right? For other people, this statement that there was nothing here might be followed by a litany of descriptors of all that had been absent. For instance, there were no houses, there were no farms, there was no cotton, there were no churches, there were no schools, there were no roads, and so forth. So in other words, again, before the 0 point of immigrant settlement, all the things that make this world a world had not yet commenced. Echoing their own biblical narratives of creation, the colonos create a world, which is the same thing as a colony, out of a savage wasteland, transforming the primordial nothing of the bushland into the meaningful form of a plantation. And depending on the interlocutor, this kind of primordial nothing can include the presence of indigenous people or exclude them. For the most part, indigenous presence or absence in these narratives doesn't alter the status of the land as a vacant wilderness prior to colono arrival. So getting back to Estanislava herself does not, as I said, she doesn't deny that Aborígenes lived in Chaco prior to the founding of her parents' colony. And she sort of moves easily between these two seemingly incommensurable narratives, right? Although there was nothing and no one on the land where the colony was built, she also describes, quote, Indians who went about naked as one of the hardships that the immigrants had to overcome in the region. And at one point, she attributed these, sometimes she calls them indios, the vocabulary changes. She attributed these to passerbys, coming from the landscape itself, while other times she points out that they were coming from river regions further north, so sort of an influx from an external space within Chaco, external to civilization, external to the colony. So this spatial estrangement of native origins to locales outside the precise terrains of the colony is one of the critical modes of settler governmentality. I would argue that that is at work here, and I won't discuss this in depth right now, but it bears stressing here that for interlocutors like Estanislava, indigenous presence in Chaco prior to the immigrants' founding does not make pre-settler Chaco any less of a desert. Rather, it's very much like there's this famous Argentine author called Sarmiento, who wrote a book called Civilization and Barbarism in 1845. And there's this iconic desert, that trope that sort of that's introduced. He's not the first one to talk about it, but that's famously postured in his work. This desert is, as I said before, indigenous people are constitutive of the desert slack, and in no way compromise the virginal status of the soil that the immigrants came to plant. So maybe just another telling quote that's sort of refers back to a kind of Genesis trope. In the beginning, this was a gringo town. There was nobody until the colonos came to settle, to work the land, and to plant cotton seeds. There were no pueblos originarios here. There were no criollos. There were no gauchos. Before the gringos, this place did not exist. So, I think I'm going to skip over some of this guy, but what I found super interesting about his name is Juan. What for him, it's super important that the origin is in the New World. I specifically would say, would ask, because they have these very strong immigrant identities that serve to reinforce a sort of European modernity when they're in the midst of basically a collapsing South American plantation society, right? And so this European white origin is super important, but at the same, but when these people are talking about origins within this context, it's very clear that this event of founding, of creating a world, is absolutely essential. And I ask him, what do you mean? What do you mean by origins? And he says, when I talk about origins, what I mean, I'm talking about here, not Europe. The origin is here. It begins after these immigrants, the first inhabitants. This is another very common reversal. This thing. There's an Ojibwe scholar, Jean O'Brien, who wrote a book called Firsting and Lasting. This is a super clear instantiation of this going on here. This, in order to enable this worlding narrative, which is absolutely essential to them having a world as settlers, they need to posit themselves as first, and so that means that the indigenous cannot occupy that firstness. So the fact that this assertion that the origin is here is sustained at all costs in very creative ways. How am I doing for time? I'm if someone can
well, the 20 minutes are up already, but you can go on for a bit, but not too long.
Okay, let me try to just quickly say one or two more things. So in addition to, this is not just a discursive move, there is also a lot of very affectively embodied kind of rituals of settler belonging, such as there is a case that I examined where these colonos had gotten the government to refurbish the first settler house in a specific colony, and this was a world-making ritual. It's an example of what I was saying at the beginning, that there's a kind of labor that has to constantly be renewed in order to sustain this world making, this kind of fragile in a way world making story. And so on the one hand, it's completely hegemonic. On the other hand, it's also extremely fragile. And it becomes, I found that the more indigenous people would let's say, at a time, let's say when 500 indigenous people had a roadblock to protest certain repressive policies by settler-run government, that these settler narratives would become even stronger. The need for these world-making rituals would kind of proliferate. And so that's one other thing I wanted to say. And then another thing is that the labor component is something I've been very interested in thinking through, because because I came to fieldwork with a kind of very much a settler colonial studies set of literatures. I wasn't engaging very much with Black studies literatures. And I take very seriously something that Tyrone Palmer has also pointed out, the specificity of the fungibility of the Black body in this tradition of chattel slavery. That's not what's going on here in this particular settler colonial context. At the same time, it does seem like when you have exploitation, all of a sudden you have, at least discursively, a vocabulary of Blackness that sort of circulates. And I wonder if there is a kind of something metonymically going on there, because the settlers will sometimes use different terms to different metonymic evocations of Blackness to describe indigenous people whose not just their land, but also they didn't only steal their land, but also exploited their labor on that land. So I guess I will end there and we can start a discussion. Thank you so much.
Many thanks, Tamar. That was great.